sponsored a new show called Your Healthcare. We have just changed the name from Healthcare Forum to Your Healthcare. And our first guest today in the new show, Your Healthcare, is Dr. Kinnari Parikh. Dr. Parikh is well known in the community in Stockton, and people who are out of Stockton and have joined in. I will introduce her formally to you so that you know who our speaker is. You know that ADS brings very unique and interesting topics of common interest and are very helpful in our day-to-day life and decision making. And we also find very unique and highly qualified speakers to deliver these topics. So today I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Kinnari Parikh, who is a clinical faculty in the internal medicine residency program at San Joaquin General Hospital in Stockton, California since 2009. She's also a palliative care consultant in the same hospital from 2012. So she has a lot of experience under her belt when it comes to the palliative care delivery to the citizens of San Joaquin County. She was a chief resident in 2008 in the internal medicine program at the San Joaquin General Hospital, which is a very prestigious position and important position to be because the program is extremely competitive with the residents, and to become their chief resident is a credential by itself. She finished her residency from 2006 to 2009. And she came there from BJ Medical College, Ahmedabad. Many of us know that. Some of you are on the program today who know that school very, very well. Kinnari is board certified in hospice and palliative care medicine as well as internal medicine. She has a large body of research experience and faculty development. She has been a judge in the American College of Physicians annual programs consistently for many, many years. If I go over her publications and her credentials, it will take a long time, but I can tell you that I have a very long resume with. I have been fortunate enough that I had the opportunity to work with such a great physician for many, many years. And she has been absolutely wonderful right from the training days now to today when she is an esteemed colleague of mine. So today she is going to talk about the palliative care, and in fact, I wanted to introduce the topic, but nobody does it better than Kinnari herself. So I'm going to hand over the microphone to Kinnari. And Kinnari, please go ahead with your slides. Welcome to ADS-sponsored Your Healthcare. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So today we're going to discuss the topic of the power of palliative care. You know, with our culture, it's always have been difficult. Even in spite of being a palliative care physician, I always have encountered multiple challenges that I can say that it is a difficult topic, or maybe that's the topic we commonly don't discuss in the house. So today we're going to learn a little bit about the palliative care. I will definitely be happy to answer any questions which come across as we go along.
આપણે કિન્નરીનો ઝૂમ ઉપર કઈક મીટિંગ છે ચાલે છે એનું લેક્ચર
Are you okay, Kinnari?
Yes, I don't know why my slides are not moving, Dr. Srivastava. Okay, now it goes here.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So the objectives for today's lecture or today's topic is the role of palliative care and hospice care in caring for a seriously ill patients, communicating effectively these difficult decisions about the use of life-prolonging treatments with our family members, and the importance of managing the pain and non-pain symptoms at the end of life, and the importance of advanced directives. Now, death is the end of life process, and dying is the end process of life. It can become very stressful when one comes to know that he or she is going to die due to an incurable disease. So we need to understand that the heal is more important than to cure. Therefore, the palliative care focuses on comprehensive pain management as well as increasing the quality of the life of the patients. Palliative care can also reduce the fear of dying and prepares the family for bereavement. So, as you understand so far, the palliative care is a multidisciplinary approach and a specialized medical care for the patients with the serious illnesses. The goal of the therapy is to improve the quality of life and mitigate the suffering among the people with the serious complex illnesses.
Therapy.
In the past, the palliative care was started more disease specific. It was more related to the cancer patients, but then the WHO has taken a more broader approach now that the principles of the palliative care should be applied as early as possible to all the chronic and ultimately fatal illnesses to improve the quality of life. So this is the WHO definition of palliative care, is an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families facing problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by the means of early identification and impeccable assessments and treatments of pain, other problems, physical, psychosocial, or spiritual. So it's not only when we consider pain, it's not only always the physical pain, it could be a spiritual pain, it could be a psychosocial pain. So basically the whole aspect of the palliative care is to take care of all symptoms and improve the quality of the life at the end of life. So little history behind the palliative care. It was first introduced in 1960 by Dame Cicely Saunders in UK. In 1980s, the rapid progress was made in developing a palliative care as a separate discipline in the healthcare delivery system. Palliative medicine became the separate board certification or a subspecialty of the medicine in the United States in 2006 and in India in 2012 later on. So what is the palliative care? Is an appropriate for individuals with any serious illnesses across any age spectrum. It can be provided as the main goal of care or in tandem with the curative treatment. So palliative care can be provided in the variety of the contexts, like in the hospital setting, outpatient, inpatient, in the nursing home, in the home setting. It is a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just run by the physicians. It's the team approach of the physician, nurses, occupational physical therapists, psychologists, social workers, chaplains, and dietitians. So it is a multidisciplinary team approach. In contrast, hospice is a comprehensive care system for the patients expected to live less than 6 months. Its sole focus of the care is on the comfort and the relief of the suffering from individuals at their life's end. There is a common myth when we talk about the palliative care. Oh, are you talking about a hospice? Am I going to live less than 6 months, or am I near the end of my life? So that's the common myth between the hospice care and the palliative care, and this is a two separate entity. So usually these are the three kinds of the care we provide, right? Curative care, where our primary focus is the cure to the illness and prolonging the life. When the palliative care comes, the focus is on the comfort and the quality of the life that may be provided with the other treatments. So there might be still the ongoing treatments with the palliative care, versus the hospice is the focus on a comfort and a quality of life when a cure is not possible with the specialized care and services. So these are the three ways we differentiate the care: the curative, palliative, and a hospice care. As I said earlier, the palliative care is not a hospice care. So there are differences between these two. And the first three is the same: the physical and psychosocial relief from both palliative care and a hospice care. It both focuses on the quality of life. It is a multidisciplinary approach, but palliative care can provide at any stage of the disease, versus the hospice is the prognosis less than 6 months. Palliative can be provided with the concurrent with the curative treatment, versus the hospice care excludes the curative treatment and only be provided once somebody is less than 6 months of the survival, and the curative treatment is no longer option or no longer beneficial, I would say. So here is the characterizing death for most of our elders or baby boomers, or the patients with the serious illnesses. So many older adults that experience the dying is usually entails the inadequately treated physical distress, pretty fragmented care system, at least in the United States, we don't have a universal healthcare system. So it's a fragmented care of system. The clinic doesn't talk to the emergency room doesn't talk to the hospital, or one hospital doesn't talk to the other hospital. The poor or absent communication among the clinicians, patients, and families. Many times, even a primary care physicians who has known the patients, maybe from many of our family physicians or internal medicine physicians who have known the patients for many, many years, but sometimes just the end of life decisions are not addressed because there is always that communication gap between the physicians, between the patients or the families. And it brings the enormous strains on the family, caregivers, and the support systems. The end of life demographic in the United States. So majority of the death occurs in the United States in the older adults. The seriously ill patient spends most of their final months maybe bound to the home, but the death occurs mostly in the hospital or in the nursing home, which could be very according to your demographic or the regional area. The need for the paid caregiver or the institutionalizations like in a nursing home placement or assisted living placement in the last month of the life is much higher. The older adults with a cognitive impairment or dementia are more likely to spend their last days in the nursing home rather than at their own home. So this is the old model of the medical care where we try to keep going behind the curative treatment. We don't talk about the quality of life or the suffering. And then the hospice concept is there, but by the time the hospice is involved in the care, it's pretty close to the time of the death, which is why the new model, which we call as a continuum of the care, talks about concomitant palliative care with the disease-modifying treatment, as the graph shows. And we do include the palliative care more towards the maybe the advanced stage of the disease before the hospice care. And after the death, also, it includes the bereavement support for the family or the loved ones who are left behind. So here are some of the basic roles of the palliative care. Definitely the management of the pain and any other symptoms, bringing up early the goals of care of the person and the advanced care planning, deciding if ever the person is not able to make their decision, who will be that next of kin, who do you trust, or power of attorney, coordination of the care, limiting or fewer ER visits, admissions to the hospital or ICU visits at the end of life, maybe early recognition of the hospice eligibility or enrollment, less aggressive care at the end of the life, which are futile, and then the family support. So what are the diagnoses? Could be a right diagnosis for the palliative care. So any metastatic cancer, stage 3 or 4, with the failure of multiple regimens of the treatment may be an ideal candidate. Advanced lung disease with the frequent exacerbation, like in patients with the emphysema, COPD, who are on a home deteriorations despite dialysis. Neurodegenerative diseases like an ALS, multiple sclerosis requiring feeding tubes or ventilator support. Stroke with the resultant function decrease by 50% of the prior capacity and considered life-limiting. Catastrophic multiple trauma or patient who is on a long-term ventilator use. Any diagnosis with a life-limiting illness or in the declining function with the decreased ability to complete one's daily activities with the advanced age, advanced dementia, in the old advanced age with the unrelating unexplained weight loss, hospital admissions from the nursing home facilities, the care, or at the end, if your physicians or a care team or patient or family needs the help with the complex decision making and the determinations of the goals of care, then the palliative care does play a role and can help with those goal of care determinations. So what are some of the common symptoms we concurrently try to manage along with the treatment of the any diseases is the pain, nausea, vomiting, anxiety, depression, constipation, difficulty breathing, dyspnea, anorexia, fatigue, or insomnia or difficulty sleeping. These are the common symptoms which sometimes not addressed with the maybe the main focused or the main end organ symptoms. It is always, in my understanding, it's very difficult to even our own household to initiate any of these discussions with our grandparents, with parents, or even anybody who we know. So these are some questions to maybe, start a dialogue, or at least make the person feel comfortable or know how much they know or understands. So I would start with maybe, what do you understand about your own illness? Or when you first started having a symptoms, what did you think it might be? Do they have an understanding? What have other doctors or have told you, or what they know about their health conditions depends upon the test they have done. And what are you hoping for, or what are you worried about? Those are the two main questions. So anybody who is suffering or going through any of the chronic complex illnesses, there must be something they may not be freely able to talk about, or they might have some underlying hidden worries that might not give them a peace of mind or the relief from the spiritual side. So there are two ways, one can address, or one can at least make those decisions and make sure that everybody else knows about their decisions. So whenever the time comes, then this does not become the last minute choice or the last minute decisions. So the POLST form is like a bright pink form. Many of you might have seen it or might have been using it with your patients. I see a lot of doctors and medical colleagues in the forum here. So the POLST is a physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment form. It gives the seriously ill patients more control over their end-of-life care, including the medical treatment, extraordinary measures like a feeding tube, ventilator, CPR. It's a bright pink form, and it's pretty much universally available. State-wise, it sometimes changes the format a little bit, depends upon the California versus maybe the Arizona, might have a little difference in the form, but ultimately it's the same concept. It's signed by both, either the patient. If the patient is not able to sign for one or other reason, then the legal decision maker or the patient's next of kin. And then it can be signed by any licensed provider, which is physician, nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant. It helps reduce the patient or family suffering and make sure their wishes are known and honored at the time when it comes. So it can be changed at any time. So maybe I did my POLST form today, and then as my disease progresses and my awareness to my disease changes and my goals changes, I may want to change my wishes. Then I have a right to change my POLST form. And it does not require any notary, which is little difference than the advanced directives form. So this is the form. It's actually a very bright pink form. We always tell our older patients populations to leave the form on your refrigerators. Even the 911 or paramedics comes and they have easy access to the form. They know what your wishes are, and the treatments are given according to your goals of care and not emergently done something which you never wanted. So basically it talks about whether you allow the natural death or you do want the CPR or resuscitation attempt. And it basically, again, same thing. It drops the treatment into the three categories, which is what we talked about: curative treatment, palliative treatment, or a hospice treatment. So here the curative treatment is your full treatment. Selective treatment is maybe your palliative treatment, and the comfort focused treatment is the hospice care. So, and the second part, this is just the one page. I have split it in the two images, talks about the nutritions, whether you want the artificial nutritions or the trial period of the nutritions or no artificial nutrition by all means. As I said, it can be done either by a patient or patient's legal decision maker, which is patient's next of kin. It also talks about if you have any prior advance directives, if you have an healthcare agent, if you named in advance directives, again, the same thing, you can name it here, and is your physician's signature and the patient's signature. So this is just a one simple page, which is, I think, a much more simpler in my understanding than the advanced care directives. But advanced care directives has its own meaning, and it brings a lot more other options, which is not included in the POLS form. So any questions so far? Or Dr. Shrivastava, are we doing good? Or I'm going too fast?
No, you're doing great. Thank you so much. And we will save the questions towards the end.
Okay. So this is, as we discussed, the advanced care directive form, which is always, many of us might have done it. It's part of your living will. And it's basically your right to give the instruction about your own health, what you want, what you don't want, what you want as your decision maker. It also lets you do other things, which the POLS form does not, which is about your wishes about the donation of the organs. If you have a designated primary physicians who may you want to refer to, or who you want as your power of attorney or next of kin. Again, no form is an ultimate form, so there should not be any fear that, oh, once I do it, maybe I won't be able to go back and change my advanced directives or my wishes. No, advanced directives can also be replaced by a new form with a new date and time. This form does require a notary, so this is much more definitely legally valid form, and it's a notarized form. This is just a part of the advanced healthcare directives form, which, as I said, talks about the end of life decisions, whether the choice not to prolong the life or choice to prolong the life. Also, it talks about the, if you have a power of attorney, if you have a primary care physician designated, are you interested in the donating your organ in the event of your demise? So this form goes a little bit more in details, and it is, as I said, is a notarized form. So always a question comes many times, especially at least at the county level, when I see a patients in the hospital or in the clinic, and when we talk about it, there is always this fear that how is it the care going to be paid for? Because many times there is no understanding whether is it a covered benefit from my insurance, whether I'll have a lot of copay, or whether I will be still able to afford this. So palliative care, most health insurance, including the private and government or a Medicaid, covers the palliative care, but depends upon some of your private insurance. The coverage may vary to the extent it's covered. The hospice care, on the other hand, will be covered by all the insurances, Medicare, Medi-Cal, also regardless of the ability to pay, because there are so many what we call as a pro bono hospice, which even if we have like in a person who does not have insurance or cannot afford insurance, or many times even in our area, we come across the immigrants who may not even be documented, but there are so many hospice agencies who will be willing to take the patients on to provide the end of life care which the patient deserves. So the hospice care is, as I said, both are basically covered benefit by the most insurances. Now, we talk about a little unique populations, as we are, especially our crowd today is, we're talking about the Asian populations. So the studies have shown that the patient's family, ethnic, cultural, and religious beliefs can influence the responses to the serious illness, desire for aggressive care, or the grief or mourning. It is very different culture to culture, and how we cope with end of life decisions or a serious news in any of our family members. So not all patients and family from a particular background will respond in a similar manner either. Assuming like that can lead to a misunderstanding. Not just the one Indian will prefer this way, the all Indian will prefer that way. It all depends upon how your upbringing is, what your morals are. So there are a lot of things varies even among the same ethnic background. So we can never go by with that understanding, oh, this is a Southeast Asian population, this is a Caucasian, or this is an African American, they're gonna have a different viewpoint. So we always, even when you discuss with your own physicians, if let's say, for example, there are certain particular things according to your religious or your belief you can always talk to your provider or your physicians who you are discussing that, is there anything you want to know about my culture or my beliefs that will help you to know the plan we make together for my future? Because these are the things I would like to do, these are the things I would not like to do. Like, in our culture, I have seen that we always make decisions as a group decisions. We discuss openly in the family. We don't make a decision just based on my own choices. So, that sometimes helps, that it's okay to have a few room of the people when we are making these decisions, because everybody's input is valid and important. So it sometimes, telling your provider what's our beliefs are and what is okay and in our culture helps them also to discuss those issues and make a plan more tailored towards our care. East Indian perspectives, as I said, the family and community is interconnectedness. Our beliefs in the karma and reincarnation are the beliefs of Hinduism. The cultural and religious background of Asian Indian elders often influence their life care decisions. Many times, even my grandfather, like I have seen unfortunately, I was available both the times when my grandmother and grandfather died. And, it is just not spoken, but it's understood that, okay, these are the things will be done. My father will make the decisions, or these are the way, their health will be addressed. So sometimes it's like not spoken, but it's just, assumed, and that's how it's been dealt with. Older patients are more likely to subscribe to family-centered decisions making rather than being autonomous. Many times even we don't like to tell them that, you have XYZ life expectancy, or this is what it is. Versus here, the culture is completely different. I would first ask the patient rather than asking the family members that, hey, this is what's going on. Are you okay me delivering or discussing this with your XYZ family members, or does anybody else needs to know? So I still will take their permissions to discuss the diagnosis or prognosis with their family members, which is sometimes could be different according to the cultures. Because as I said, sometimes the family member will say, hey, please don't tell my parents about the diagnosis or this important information. So I will just leave it up to you and me, and we make the decisions moving forward. So we all have to respect the cultures and how the things are dealt with, as far as at the end of the day, we all have our best interest in the patient's care. Healthcare decisions may be made by the most senior family members or the eldest son. In Hinduism, many believe suffering is due to the karma, which is inevitable and resulting in difficulty with the symptom control. So sometimes, we all see that our older generations, they're not a complainer. They don't even like to say that they are in pain or they are having XYZ symptoms, because they just think, oh, it's a part of old age, it's a part of our karma, and we have to just suffer through it. So it's sometimes very difficult to address those symptoms if we are not even aware of those symptoms. Understand what is important to the patients and what's patients' their own preference. Determine and if and how they want the information to be given, who they want the information to be shared with, participation they want from them versus their family members. So the death practices. When close to the death, family members are likely to be present in a large numbers. Many patients prefer to die at home, and there are specific ritual practices in each religious community, which even being in an Indian community differs widely. Chantings, prayer, incense, various rituals are part of the process, which again varies according to your religious beliefs. It is accepted practice for the family members and others to have an open expression of the grief rather than many other cultures where the end of life is maybe a celebration of the life. So this is my last slide. In short, we will summarize that the palliative and hospice care are compatible with the Hindu values. Typically, the death is neither to be sought nor to be prolonged. And I always have thought that, in India, the hospice or a palliative care have not been a separate entity, but always has been part of the plan of the treatment. We kept our elders home. The family always took care of the patients at the end of life, or even with any terminal disease or diagnosis. So the palliative care aims to relieve the suffering, improve the quality of life, optimize the function, and assist with the decision-making for patients with the advanced illnesses. As I said earlier, this is not a hospice care. It is not, the prognosis is less than 6 months and no curative treatment is offered. Palliative care is offered simultaneously with all other appropriate medical treatments. Communicating the serious news always require preparations on both sides, not only the physician side or the provider side, but also on the family's side. Sensitivity to the patient's understanding, family's understanding, their emotional needs, and having an organized plan and then the follow-up on that plan. Pain should be assessed in all patients, and the adequate treatment may combine with the pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. So this is what we have. I will be open to any questions, Dr. Srivastava.
Yes, Kinnari, first of all, let me congratulate you for a wonderful presentation. This is a very complex and difficult topic to discuss, let alone practice. So, because you are working in different dynamics and very complex environment when the person is terminally ill. So you have really simplified it for us. The second thing that I would like to compliment you on, that you catered it to your audience. And towards your last few slides, you talked about the Indian ethnicity and what kind of unique characteristics our population, our families have, and what their needs are. And I think many of us are attending tonight because we have either older parents or we are going to be in that spot very soon. And then, of course, the younger people need to know because they will be taking care of their parents. So if you look at across the board, it was a very, very important and informative topic, and I want to thank you for that. I'm looking at there's a chat box. Let me see what somebody says. Well, looks like this is Dr. Aurora. Virtu, thanks for presenting such difficult and emotional topic. Thank you, Virtu, if that's what you are on iPhone. I'm waiting for the questions. Please ask your questions. If you want to put it in the chat box, that is fine. If you would like to ask directly, go ahead and ask the question directly. Your pleasure. I'll continue to wait as we proceed. I have a few things, Dr. Parikh, to ask you.
Go ahead, Dr. Srivastava.
My first question is, and I have a few questions. Okay, Virtu says again, yes, and bringing up advanced directives and not rely on relatives is an excellent point that you brought up, that you have something in writing, because the word of mouth at that emergent time when 911 is responding or you are in the emergency department may not be taken unless you have something in the writing, whether it's a post form or your advanced directive. Dhiren bhai, you have a question, please go ahead.
First of all, very nice presentation. And my question is a palliative care physician also involved in providing end-of-life care?
Yes, so palliative care physician also does the hospice care concomitantly. But the palliative care, there is no the 6 month of a main focus is still, if you continue the treatment, let's say, for example, end-stage renal disease on a hemodialysis, the dialysis is still ongoing and you work with the patient. So, some of the main thing what I have come across, Dr. Nanavati, is, yes, palliative care physicians does provide both care, but the palliative care part of it helps the symptom control, and also it gives you and a patient to make that rapport, have a discussions while the patient is not in the end stage of their life. And sometimes it's easier for them to discuss their fears or their preference with the physicians or somebody outsider, and help them at least have that understanding that, hey, start thinking about it of any of those scenario. So you have a time to make those decisions right now, or designate the decision maker who you trust, or let them know that, okay, some will say that I do want a ventilator support, but maybe after day 10, day 7 or 2 weeks, if there is no meaningful recovery, then just don't do a track and peg and leave me on a ventilator. At that point, withdraw the support. So, we all have a very unique characteristics and wishes. So the palliative care helps to have those dialogues going, and the palliative care physicians are the physicians who will be then also providing this hospice care when needed. Yes.
Great. So I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind.
Please go
Yes,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah. So for a person who is not likely to survive for too long, or you want to keep them comfortable, I have a two-part question. What kind of medications are given? And number two, how do you that the situation is not abused by somebody, they don't enhance the demise?
So answering the first questions, the medications in the palliative care, we still, in terms of the using the opiates or the analgesics or the anxiolytics, there is still, always we discuss the risk and the benefit. You do have a pain control, pain contract with your physician. So many times, let's say, for example, I have a patients with the multiple bony mets and in a significant pain, but patient is still going and pursuing the palliative chemotherapy, the radiation therapy. I would still will have a pain contract with that person. So I will be the only provider prescribing any sort of opiates or analgesics, rather than the patients going to the 2-3 different people, or a urgent care or emergency room, or their oncologist providing a pain management. So we know that. And now with the cures, we always try to make sure that we look it up, that, hey, is the patients getting medications from multiple providers, or we are the only one provider? Regarding the safety and not to have a misuse, so it's not a direct observation therapy. We always have to have any opiates or the triplicate medications picked up by the patients. It's only be given in a limited quantity once a month. We do not refill those medications. And main thing is to every now and then we do the drug screen. We can do a urine spot drug screen even in the clinic. We make sure that we always check the cures, that the patients is not taking more than what is said. Because sometimes the patients does have a tendency to come to you, get your prescription from you, then they go to some other provider, and then they have another opiates from there. So you have to look up the drug-drug interaction. So the pain contract is very important, but those are the main things. And not misusing, I think, is just the main thing. Is if your patient's running out always the medications beforehand, then either are we not giving enough, or there is a concern for a misuse, then you have to maybe prescribe lesser. But each physicians will work with you, and most of us will have a pain contract at that point. Means they are not allowed, if there is a breach in contract, then you don't provide triplicate medications.
Thank you, Dr. Parekh. Dr. Nanavati, are you satisfied with the answer? Okay. I'm sure he is. That was very elaborate answer. I would suggest that on our audience panel, there are people who are non-physicians. So the bone mets or brain mets can be simplified as the cancer has spread to the bones. That will be a little helpful. I have another question. So how do you and who decides that the patient is in need of palliative care? Is it the primary care provider who is providing curative care to the patient? They decide, or the family has to trigger, or how does it work? How would it be initiated?
So there are two ways it initiated. One is outpatient, one is inpatient. So in inpatients, I would first talk about it because I primarily practice the inpatient medicine. If I see a patient who has any of the diagnosis, what we talked about it, like a end-stage lung disease on a home oxygen, keep coming to the hospital, end-stage heart disease, who requires hospitalizations every 2 weeks, then, that's something the inpatient doctors or the social worker will bring it up that, hey, we have this program. Are you interested? Your diagnosis does qualify it. Are you interested in getting more information? And they can refer to the palliative care physicians either in-house or outpatient in the clinic setting if it's not urgent. And in the outpatient setting, it can be initiated by anybody. It can be initiated by the neurologist who is seeing the patients with the multiple sclerosis or any of the diagnosis or a severe dementia, who they feel like the patient is rapidly declining or progressing, and maybe they will benefit from a palliative care, versus the oncologist or even a primary care physicians. So outpatients, it can be, it depends upon the physicians if they see any of the trigger points, and it can always be brought up by the patient themselves or the family members. If the family members thinks that, okay, I see my uncle going through all this and there's no coordination of care, there is only, the symptoms are not managed, or maybe they will help with some of the discussions about the goals of care or filling out some of the advanced directives, then it can be referred by any of the subspecialists or the primary care physicians, or it can bring up by the family members themselves.
So that's a very important point that you mentioned about the family members and the patient themselves have the ability and empowerment to ask for evaluation for palliative care, and then palliative care consultant like yourself will evaluate the situation and see if they qualify for that care.
True.
Okay. So is there any other question? Otherwise, I'll ask my question. Okay, please raise your hand or put in chat box or just speak up, please. So my next question is that how do you coordinate? It's a very complex thing to me in my head. You know that I practice hospice in addition to ICU and pulmonary, so it's a little 180 degrees of care, or 360 degrees of total care. But in hospice, it's clear cut, 6 month prognosis, and all you have is, comfort care and not the curative care. But in palliative care, it's a very difficult situation. How do you draw the line between the palliative part and the curative part? And also, how do you coordinate the care between the two subspecialists?
So in the palliative medicine, as you said, it's concurrent care with so some of the first thing when we meet the patients, we try to get the overall picture about their health, what is their main disease, and the chronic illnesses, and then what are the symptoms they have in spite of those chronic illness symptoms along with it. Regarding the care, most of the time as any subspecialist, I would meet with the patients, have my suggestion, give it back to that, let's say, for example, oncologist, or let's say for the cardiologist, that, hey, this is what Mr. XYZ, we met and today we discussed their options, and he also has suffering from this chronic back pain which not been addressed, or that's limiting the patient's ability to even do the daily life of activities. So I would like to start the patients on XYZ medications, and then we have a follow-up at that point. Also, at the same time, once you see these patients, you start developing the dialogues between that, hey, what are they trying to achieve from their curative part of the treatment? Is even the cure possible? As you said many times, if you have an end-stage COPD on a home oxygen, unless the lung transplant is in the option, there are not a complete curative treatment we are doing, right? What we are doing is more a symptomatic treatment at that point. We are not providing a curative treatment unless, as I said, the lung transplant is an option. So then you say, okay, this is what it is. What is your main goal? My main goal is to be able to go around, able to still, travel and do XYZ. So you try to work with his as the same thing what you would do, but at the same token, we will have the, some of the dialogues going. So if ever the time comes, do you see going yourself on a ventilator? Again, the role of the advanced care directives and the goals of care and having a decision maker, are very important, and that's the main focus, along with the symptoms control. Sometimes I would see the patients are having a lot of other social problems which is not addressed. Many times in our county clinics, that's what many times more than me, they need a social worker help. And I think many of the issues that are then taken care, or the dietitians help, because the congestive heart failure patients is having a very hard time understanding, as an Indian person, what should I eat, what should I not eat, or how much fluid I should be drinking, or what is considered as 1.5 liter fluid restriction. So sometimes that's why it's a multidisciplinary approach, that it's not always the physician is the main role more playing a part here, but it's whatever is the patient's not able to get the because primary care or the subspecialist, there is not that much time. Plus, you won't have, at least the palliative care will, most of the time in the clinic, we have a social worker, dietitian, the pharmacist available to us, and we are able to sometimes just sorting out the medications. And I have been told by many of my older patients that, oh, I was on 16 medications, you made it down to like 8, the key ones. Now I don't have to take half of them, and it makes a lot of difference, because now at least he's able to take the Lasix which he needed to take, rather than the forgetting between the polypharmacy. So sometimes rather than adding more, we just take out unnecessary things, and it helps. So as I said, it's just knowing the patients, coordinating the care between their main disease process and the rest of the other issues, and helping them with the clarifying their goals early on. It's main focus.
So it is safe to say that once the palliative care is initiated, the coordination of care takes place with multidisciplinary team, and my acute care or the curative care physicians, they may be subspecialists or specialists, and the palliative care team and the physician. So we don't have to worry about anything that we have to find out what the cardiologist is saying, or what the primary care physician is saying, or what the palliative care is saying. So you meet and then you develop a plan of care. Is that the correct impression I get from
definitely, because definitely is the oncologist will be the final decision maker. Let's say, for example, I have a patient who is in the stage 4 cancer. They have tried multiple different rounds of chemotherapy, and if now the prognosis or the outcome or the options of the treatment changes by the oncologist, then I will be notified, or there is always a communications that now this patient may be ideal for a hospice level of care, or the patient is not tolerating a chemotherapy and there are no further options. So yes, it's the coordination of the care, and we do not stop anything unless we, the primary physicians or the subspecialist physician is on board with that plan.
So you also made a very, very important point that I would like to re-emphasize, is what is in medical language is called the pill burden. The more medications you take, it occupies time of your day when you are taking the medication 4 times a day, and handful of them just like your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that is a part of the suffering in the language of palliative care and hospice. So reducing the pill burden is a very, very big thing in these specialties, where the unnecessary medications are discontinued, and you really don't have to have a large pill burden causing your deterioration of your quality of life. So thank you for bringing that point. I'm still waiting for more questions from the audience. I know this is a topic that is relatively foreign to us, but I think after today, this audience is going to be very, very aware of the palliative care. And of course, you mentioned something about hospice care, which is another thing. There is a question from Virtu. She would like to know any resources in San Joaquin County for patients. And let me see, it disappeared from my screen. And families, care center, day center, senior center, are there any such facilities that you are aware of, Dr. Parikh?
I'm not aware of any care center day, but I do know that the Hospice of San Joaquin does do a lot of just like at least not recently with the COVID, but hopefully it should start soon. But the Hospice of San Joaquin does do a lot of reach out and a lot of times they always have a booth at any of the healthcare seminars. They do a lot of lectures, which is just for. And now we do have a lot of other private hospices who does maybe differently, but I have seen the American Hospice, who is owned by a Punjabi physicians, and they do a little outreach program in the Gurudwara. I have seen the Hospice of San Joaquin have their family or patients education lectures, which is also free for anybody to attend.
I would like to point out that the Hospice of San Joaquin is a non-profit organization. Town of Stockton and neighborhood towns have another 30 hospices in the area, which are for-profit organizations. CMS in 2018 decided to open and allow the for-profit hospices. And since then, there is a big proliferation of hospices in every county and every city. The advantage of that is that there is a lot of competition between the hospices, and they do have a lot of educational and outreach programs. So definitely there are a lot of resources available. Right now, we are definitely impeded by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the activity level is low, but nevertheless, there is still a lot of educational activity that goes around. Thank you for that clarification, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Shrivastava. It's very true, Dr. Shrivastava, what he said. Only the Hospice of San Joaquin is the county run, and they're the only one who, at least I know, unless Dr. Shrivastava knows anybody, other hospice who has even the hospice house. It's a very beautiful house, and actually they take care of the patients in their last few days to weeks. They have a even place for the families to be with the patients, where certain times the care cannot be handled at the home, and they have the really nice hospice house, which pretty much gives you an experience of the staying in your own house with your loved ones, but they may require like a continuous IV medications or the oxygen or the drip. So the Hospice of San Joaquin has a very beautiful hospice house.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm aware of it because I happen to be their medical director, so.
Okay.
Thank you. My other question is, since you talked about the hospice house and the patient can be transferred from the home setting to the hospice house setting, Chandrakant, I'll come to you after this conversation. I know you have a question. How about if the patient is on palliative care, do they have to be in the hospital, or they could still be at home and palliative care can be provided at home?
So the palliative care can be initiated anywhere and can be provided in the home setting also, in the nursing home setting also. Many times if the patient is still getting up and around and doing their daily activities and living independently, they are just managed in the palliative care clinic, where the visits are also does not need to be that frequently, versus somebody who is symptoms are not managed can be more aggressively. But as Dr. Shrivastava said, it could be home setting, hospital setting, nursing home setting, or even a office setting, basically.
Okay, thank you. Charles, you had a question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, actually, hi. I did not have a question. I was just listening. I came late to join, but however, I'm listening to Dr. Parikh, and I'm not that far to the hospital. We just had a little recent heart attack, so I'm under Dr. Surrender Raina's care for an artery stent, and I'm having a stent, and I'm having one in October, first week, the second artery stent to be put. So my question
it's you yourself?
Topic. Yes, myself. I had a heart attack.
Okay, well, we are happy to see you healthy and on the show here. Kinnari, you want to address his?
Definitely. So I didn't get the question, Chandrakant Bhai.
I can't.
Okay, so you told us about your medical condition. The question is, do you have a question for Dr. Parikh, or you just wanted to share the information with us?
No, I'm just sharing the information. Actually, right now, I don't have any much question. But
what do you want to ask? Yeah, he had he's asking is that he had a heart attack 2 weeks ago and had
Yes.
a stent put in one artery. The other one is going in 10 days.
Yes.
So, what do you want to ask? How to
No, I
take
don't.
care?
No, I just don't have any question.
Well,
I was
you're
just
sharing
because
information.
you asked me that if I had any question, but
yeah.
I was just listening
So you
patiently.
can always
Dr.
ask him, how
Parvez.
do you take care of it? Especially,
Yeah. Well, I'll paraphrase this. I'll paraphrase this. This is what my role is, that how can I take the information and turn it into a relevant question. So I would like, if I was Chandrakant Bhai and I had a stent done and I have another stent coming up, I have few risk factors for coronary artery disease. And is there a role of palliative care at this point in my care, whether I should continue with my curative care and not bother about palliative care, or should I consider looking at the palliative care as an option?
So I think it's a very valid question, Chandrakant Bhai. As I'm hope you're doing well and taking all your medications and going for your second procedure. But I think it's never late or never too early to say that have some sort of your own decisions to be discussed with your family members, or put it down as Virtu was saying earlier, that when emergency arrives, I think something happens to our brain. We cannot think straight, we cannot make the right decisions, and it becomes very difficult also for the family members. If I have never said what I would want and what I don't want, then making that decisions, the children feels that, oh, the burden is on my shoulder to make this decision for my father. What if he didn't want that way? So I think the only one thing I would say is that sometimes even at the having a evening coffee, it's not a bad idea to have these discussions, and it's never a good discussions to have it, or nobody is ready to have it, but to have your advance directives in place is very important thing, I would say. That way it helps not only you, your family members, your friends, your doctors, everybody to be aware that, okay, these are the things he wants, these are the things, if ever in case if it happens, he doesn't want. So there is a understanding between everybody that what is your own choices are. So palliative care in this case, at least sometimes it's difficult to have those decisions, or maybe we are not aware of all the options fully. So it's never a wrong idea to meet, because you don't like the care, or you don't like that person, or you don't think that you need it, you don't need to continue it. But at least it will help to have some of those dialogues going and have it in your mind. So when you feel right about it, maybe you can make those important decisions.
yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
true. That's very true.
That's very important. So I have a follow-up question on that, Kinnari, for you on behalf of Chandrakant Bhai. The question is, Ritu, I'll come to you in a second. The follow-up question is, does he need advanced care document filled, or does he need a post form filled, or does he need both of them filled?
So either one is fine. As far as, so in the hospital or in the clinic, we just do the post form because we don't need the notary, we don't need any witnesses. It's much easier to do it, and it's still a valid document. You can just put it on your refrigerator, or have a copy in your, take a picture and have a copy in your phone. Nowadays, it's the most easiest thing for you to show to somebody, but have it on the house somewhere easily available for the others. So I would say advanced directives is much more detailed in a legal form, versus the post is just very easy. You can do it at any time, even in the clinic when you are visiting, or right before your procedure in the hospital. So either way is fine. If you don't have a time, go for a post form. If you have a time and you're already working on your living will or all other legal documents for your financial stuff, then maybe have advanced directives.
Sure.
So we wish you good luck. Continue to lower your risk factors along with what Dr. Rana recommends, and we'll see you back on the show next week. Virtu, you have a comment, please go ahead.
Yeah, I
Take
just
care.
want to share something. Nothing with Chandrakant Bhai's situation. I do wish him speedy recovery.
Thank you.
I was working at a nursing home many years ago in Stockton, And there were two families who came in at the same time. And both of them had a family member who had a stroke. And they were both on feeding tubes, the G tubes. And it was the feeding tube that were keeping them alive. One family had an advance directive in place. Their children, their family members, their relatives all understood the wishes of the person to try 4 to 6 weeks. And if the feeding tube is not going to come off, then just let them go peacefully. The other family, on the other hand, had no advance directive. There were 3 or 4 adult children, and nobody wanted to take the responsibility of stopping the feeding tube. And this person suffered. He was in nursing home for a year. The mobility was affected, pressure ulcers, pressure sores. He could not talk, so he could not give his, he was not in the legal condition at that time after having that stroke to do an advance directive. I see such a huge difference. It was a day and night difference in having your advance directive, having your wishes placed on paper beforehand. So the relatives, even the children, nobody wants to take the blame of pulling the plug or stopping the feeding tube and then listen to other children or family members yelling or bringing them up on holidays and blaming them. There's just so much emotional and family stuff that goes into it. So I actually really want to thank Dr. Parikh for bringing such an important and neglected topic in our community on stage and presenting it so well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Virtu. You said it very right. Nobody likes to pull the plug, even though in your mind you know that what is the right thing. It's very, very difficult when you are the one who are put on that spot to make the decisions. And it's so good to know that, hey, we are not doing anything wrong. We are respecting the wishes of our loved ones. And maybe they don't deserve to be as what you explained with the bed sores or with the pressure ulcers, infections, just laying in there and maybe getting visitation 15 minutes a day from a family member. That's not the life any one of us would ever imagine or picturize.
Yes, it's a very complex topic, and the underlying tone is the emotional attachment, and you have to overcome that emotional attachment at some point. In our families, we do not like to discuss this topic. Nobody would like to talk about death, palliative care, hospice, anything to do with life or the terminal state of life. We believe that we are invincible and we will live forever, and we don't prepare ourselves very well. So that topic is very timely, and there is no better time than this. So the population is aging, just like, and resources are so much. The counterpart of it is that people like us who provide ICU care, Dr. Kinnari is my partner in crime. We cover ICU together. We did last week, and again next week we are doing it together. And I tell you, because of the resources, we can keep people alive even if they have no future in that sense forever. Well, not forever, of course, but for a long time. And that is just pure suffering and poor quality of life. So you really have to look at the balance and counterbalance and look through the emotional attachment with the reality, and stop thinking about yourself and being selfish, and think what this person is going through, who is in the bed and suffering every day with a poor quality of life. So anyway, that's my editorial comment a little bit on that. One more question. Anybody else coming up with a question here? I don't see any hands or anybody speaking up. My question is, you mentioned about the Indian ethnicity, etc. Many of us have family members in India. Are you aware of any palliative care resources in India? And what's the status of palliative care at this time in India?
So I would say there are many, same thing like here, many private organizations, especially for a hospice and a palliative care. The main focus or the main organization which started is based on a Kerala in India. The Kerala has done an amazing job about introducing the hospice and a palliative care as a part of the continuum of the care. But it's available everywhere. It's available in Ahmedabad, the BJ Medical College. When I was there, even the cancer institution had bring up the palliative and a hospice care. In India, if somehow either the pain threshold is too high or the opiates are not available, but I don't see them using as freely, which is a good thing in a way, but also sometimes you really need it. It's not that, you're addicted or you are putting a patient into an unnecessary, like in a state of sleep or medications for anxiety, but the opiates or anxiolytics are not widely used or commonly prescribed. It's not the practice in India like here, but then more and more, the awareness is getting there. The major cities, I do know that at least in Gujarat, the Ahmedabad has it, Surat has it, Kerala, Delhi, Bombay. So, and even in India, the anesthesiologist or a lot of critical care specialists, they are doing, and a lot of our MDs, the internal medicine doctors, the surgery doctors, the hemonc doctors are doing a 1-year fellowship into a hospice and palliative care.
That's very good information, because I did not know that they had the fellowship. It is so formalized. I was aware of the hospice organizations in India, but definitely not aware of the
But
available, which is
as
wonderful.
you said,
Yeah, and the way our family structure is there as a combined family, we always like to believe that somebody will take care of them, but they are not trained professionally, and the level of care is not very effective if just rendered by the family member. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Any other questions? We are at the top of the hour, actually past. I would like to close the meeting tonight. Last call for the questions, comments, compliments. Anybody? If not, I would like to thank Dr. Kinnari Parekh for a wonderful presentation today on this extremely important topic that we should review and remember. And I would like to invite you again, Dr. Parekh, to this forum in future, whenever the time allows on your part. I know how busy you are. On behalf of the ADS, I would like to profusely thank you for donating your time today. And on behalf of our audience, I would like to say thanks. And there is a hand up. Kavita ji, you are on. Please unmute yourself and go ahead. Oh? Is that an accident? The hand is up. We cannot hear you because you are muted.
That's a clapping. That's a clapping emoji. So she's saying good job.
I better take an in-service in emojis then in that case. Well, I'll go back
Thank
on
you
behalf
so
of
much.
our audience.
It was very good. I was clapping.
Oh, thank you so much.
thank you, Auntie.
Hey, Deepak Bhai, can you ask her when she graduated from BJ Medical College?
2004.
Oh my. Okay, I graduated from NHL, and don't ask when.
Dhiren
I
bhai,
won't. I know.
I would not like to ask that. We are scared already.
I can guess maybe 1975.
71.
Okay.
Dhiren bhai, when?
1971, I passed MBBS.
You passed.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Wow. We are very proud of you, Dhiren bhai. You're still practicing orthosurgery and medicine. That's amazing. It's good to hear that we can go that far with the mental acuity. Dhiren bhai is a prime example anyway. Everybody knows that. Yeah.
You too. All of you are. Thank you so much.
I don't know about myself, but yeah. But I would like to again say thank you so much on behalf of all the audience, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. The session was very, very informative. And on behalf of the ADS, thank you so much. I'll conclude the session here, and please come back. We will be back in your healthcare show in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Oh, and we have an upcoming presentation by Dr. Srivastava on a very, very important topic again. If you would like to share something on that, Dr. Srivastava.
All right. When the boss says share something, I better do. Thank you, Virtu, for reminding me. Recently, we have been hearing a lot about the different COVID-19 variants and the booster vaccine. Booster vaccine versus the third dose of the same vaccine. There is a lot of confusion in the language, the way it has been disseminated at this time. It is apparent last Friday, that is day before yesterday, FDA went ahead and approved Moderna and Pfizer vaccine for the third dose, which some people have called booster dose. And the difference being booster connotes somehow that it covers the variants. Actually, it does not. It is simply the third dose of the same vaccine, which is nevertheless going to be effective. And we have whatever information that we have, and we'll share it more, that what is the impact of this Delta variant, which is very prevalent and extremely contagious. I suggest that you still, even if you are vaccinated completely, continue to practice wearing masks, social distancing, and hand hygiene. But then there is a Peruvian variant, which is Lambda, considered to be extremely resistant, and then the Mu, which is from Colombia. So there are these various strains which are floating around, and you have to protect yourself with them. Having said that, if you are completely vaccinated, the impact of these variants have been less. Patients have been admitted in the hospital, many with comorbid conditions, but there are few who have no comorbid conditions. They were fully vaccinated and still got the COVID. The good news is the impact is not that high. If you are non-vaccinated, I strongly suggest that you get the vaccination, because is going to be a lifesaver should you get infected with Delta virus, which is extremely contagious. So we are going to cover this information as it comes out of the FDA, as it comes out of the CDC, the Pfizer, as well as the Moderna labs. They are studying it continuously. FDA committee was very reluctant to start this booster dose in general population, like everybody. They did not want to use it. So they have come up with, right now the recommendation is that you should be 8 months out of your second dose, number one. Number two, you have to be 65 or older. And number three, there are about 10 or 12 other conditions which are immune suppressive conditions, etc., are defined when you need this booster dose. For remainder of us, booster is not, or third dose is not recommended at the point. So in 2 weeks, whenever, I think it's 10/3, when we get together, we'll have little more information. They are also looking at the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and FDA India. If you are not aware of it, FDA has 4 offices in India, which is the US FDA operating in India for Indian epidemiology and Indian control of all these matters. They have not addressed the COVID Shield, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the other local vaccines. So we will learn a lot, hopefully in 2 weeks. And I'm gathering the latest information, and I'm hoping to share that with you on 10/3, which is the October 3rd, is a Sunday again. So thank you very much for listening. Virtu, I'm going to stop the recording and leave the Zoom on for the